to Doc Chat. My name is Adnan Wase from POV. Today we are talking with Joshua Oppenheimer of the POV film The Act of Killing, which we aired about 2 months ago. And one of the reasons why we've waited so long for this chat is because Joshua has been very busy with his new film, The Act of Killing. But we are, the new film is The Look of Silence. But we're very happy to have Joshua here with us. Thank you for joining us today with this chat with viewers.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So The Act of Killing was one of the, I think it's not one of the, it was the most lauded film of the last year when POV did a poll. It blew everyone away and won, kind of swept the critics, won so many awards, just countless awards, and people have just said this is one of those films where it really asks us to think about what is documentary filmmaking. And so we're happy to have Joshua here today to talk to us about not just about The Act of Killing and The Look of Silence, but about his filmmaking process and how he thinks about documentaries today. Now, since we last talked, Joshua, which is a little while ago, and you have been busy racking up awards for The Look of Silence at festivals, you've also been named a MacArthur Genius, so congratulations with that. That must be exciting.
Well, thank you. I'm sure it's not deserved, but thank you.
I'm sure it is. So Joshua is going to be very humble, so I'm going to make sure to keep pulling out the truth from his humility. So we'll get started with questions, and for anyone who's live with us right now on Google+, feel free to leave your questions there. We are monitoring social media very closely with your questions. So anytime something comes up, leave a comment, leave a question, and we'll relay those as soon as we can back to Joshua. But Joshua, I wanted to just get started, first of all, about how you came to making films. So I know that The Act of Killing was a long process, but take us back to the beginning of when or why you became a filmmaker, if you can.
It's really strange. I see filmmaking as my way of exploring the world in all its richness, mystery, majesty, and complexity. And I came to filmmaking unusually, I suppose, from theoretical physics. I was interested in understanding the nature of the universe, and then I realized that there was that we wouldn't exist. We would never be able to understand why we exist, and maybe why there is existence at all. So I started to look at then the mysteries of what it means to be human, and filmmaking sort of evolved. At one point, I just knew at some point in the middle of my undergraduate studies that I would return. It was during a break in my college years that I would return to college and change my major and continue as a filmmaker. And I never really understood why. I'm not someone who had a love of cinema growing up. I was the youngest in my family, so we'd always go to movies that were too old for me, for which I was too young. Movies that were invariably frightening and had plots that I couldn't understand or follow. So I never thought of myself as a storyteller. I still don't. Because I could never understand the plots of the movies I was watching as a kid, and I always thought of myself and my filmmaking as a way of exploring the world, a way of getting really deep recesses of humanity, and my way of understanding what does it mean to be human.
And what were those? What were the first things that you made? Did you start making documentary films? Did you start with fiction, with shorts?
No, I started actually, and I've always explored the boundary between fiction and documentary. My mentor was this really wild and wonderful Yugoslav filmmaker named Dusan Makavejev, who made classics like W.R., Mysteries of the Organism, Sweet Movie, Innocence Unprotected in the 70s. And he, sort of standing on his shoulders, I was exploring what happens when you combine fiction and documentary. And I didn't think of myself as a documentary filmmaker at the beginning, and in some ways I still don't. I just think of myself as a filmmaker. But I became interested then from that in to what extent is our seemingly factual world, to what extent is it actually made up of fantasy and fictions? To what extent do we only know ourselves through this world, through the stories we tell about the world, and to what extent are those stories always already somehow fiction, fantasy. And so I've always been interested in using filmmaking as a way of exploring how the factual is made up of fiction. I think when you film anybody, with a nonfiction camera, with a documentary camera, the first thing they start doing is staging themselves. They start acting out the half-remembered, second-hand, third-rate scripts by which they know themselves, and performing these for you. They start acting out how they wish they appeared, how they want to be. And that's this opportunity to make visible in that moment of self-consciousness, which many documentary filmmakers will try and leap past, to try and actually at least pretend to be a transparent window onto factual reality. But if you don't try and leap past that self-consciousness, you actually have this opportunity to see, to make visible the fantasy that make us. The non-fiction film camera in its state of nature, if you like, is a prism. The non-fiction film camera in its state of nature is this kind of prism which, because people start acting, staging themselves, we're able to see how people want to be seen, the stories and fictions that make us who we are, and then we can infer from that how we really see ourselves. And so that has always been what interested me in nonfiction film, and gradually I moved from combining fiction and documentary as a student to actually making these films where people stage themselves in the movie.
What was the first thing you made? What was the first film that you completed and showed people?
Well, The Act of Killing is my first feature-length film. My first movie was something called The Entire History of the Louisiana Purchase, and it's not a history, and it's not about the Louisiana Purchase per se, but it was about the kind of this kind of paranoia that was sweeping the leading up to the millennium, the new millennium. I made it in 1997, and it was a story about a baby that dies in a microwave, about the militia movement, about the role of racism and the genocide against the Native Americans in the United States. It's a kind of crazy, surreal, experimental film. It's coming out. I think it'll be released by Fandor in the U.S. and by Second Run DVD outside the U.S. next year. But it's a 50-minute long sort of fiction, strange fever dream of a film that actually, in its form, mirrors, somehow is surprisingly similar in the way it goes from documentary to transforms from documentary to fever dream. It's surprisingly similar somehow to The Act of Killing.
Yeah, and we'll come back to, I mean, specifically what you've said reflects exactly on The Act of Killing. And I know even Werner Herzog was an executive producer who was also interested in an idea that you touched on about moving away from fact-based documentaries, which is something, of course, that you've done with the most recent films. But maybe this is an opportunity even to get some of your philosophy on documentary, because both Werner Herzog, Errol Morris, and yourself have talked a lot about the form and essentially the form-bending nature of the films that you've made. Can you tell us, I don't know if you've put this into words before, but for you, what is a documentary? Is that even something you recognize as a format?
Well, I sort of hesitate always to use the word documentary because I feel like I want to make a distinction. I want to somehow distance myself from the journalistic connotations of the word. And so I'll often talk of myself as a nonfiction filmmaker. And I would define that in the broadest sense as people playing themselves in front of a camera. And I would also make the point that I sort of alluded to a moment ago, that whenever you film anybody, they start performing in front of the camera. One of the myths of one of the myths of fly on the wall documentary is that if you film somebody for long enough, they will forget that you're there, and you will actually be able to record how they behave if they aren't there. And that's, of course, nonsense and sort of an insult to our intelligence. And the way you can see that very easily is just imagine that you're alone having a very, very intimate conversation with your mother or your partner. And now imagine you're having this, sitting down with your mother or your partner talking about the same subject, but you're being filmed by you're not alone. There's a film crew in the room, and the film crew, you know, they're making a film about you, and you know that they have the power to shape and determine your public image forever going forward. Who could ever confuse those two situations? No matter how long you've been filmed by this film crew, you could never confuse being alone with somebody versus with being alone, being filmed by somebody, sitting with somebody and being filmed at the same time. Nobody could ever confuse those situations. By the way, that nonfiction film, whenever you film anybody, they perform, they play, they act, and we can either and in that sense, it's always a collaboration between the person being filmed and the filmmaker. And you can either look at documentary done in one of two ways. You can pretend that you're a transparent window onto reality. That is to say, you can collaborate with the people you film to simulate a reality in which the camera is not present. Or you can collaborate with the people you film to create situations, safe situations, in which the most important, in which you're guaranteed to excavate or explore the most important questions that lead you to film those people in the first place. And I think it's our responsibility to do the latter. And I think what makes documentary great, what makes nonfiction cinema great, are these moments when somehow what transpires in front of the camera spirals out of control, out of the control of the filmmaker, out of the control of the participant, which expect and which the filmmaker doesn't know how to respond, to which the the participant in the film doesn't know how to respond. A good example of this is of course the final scene in The Act of Killing, where I take Anwar back to the rooftop where I began the journey 5 years earlier with him, and I say to him, please tell me how, one last time, what you did here. And he's trying to do that when suddenly it's as though his whole being is interrupted, ripped in two, torn asunder by this violent fit of retching. And he has no idea what to do except to try and continue explaining what he did there despite the retching. And I have no idea what to do except to bear witness. And in a sense, if you think of documentary as a series of occasions, safe spaces where you're exploring the most important issues, and you acknowledge from the outset that all that makes it nonfiction is that it's a real person playing themselves. Space is something you set up collaboratively with the person you're filming. If you think of it that way, the chance of things flying out of control, spiraling out of control in a way that is revealing is much greater than if actually what you're trying to do is hide the apparatus of filmmaking and simulate a reality in which you're not present and which your participants or your subjects are somehow, in inverted commas and quotation marks, acting normal. In such a situation, if you have the participants acting normal in a work of direct cinema, it's very unlikely anything becomes unsafe or anything becomes out of control or truly cinematic, because there's a covenant that everybody should act. There's a tendency to perform the typical, the safest and the most typical, instead of opening a safe space into which can issue the extraordinary.
I'm sure many people who are filmmakers who are part of this chat right now are thinking, that's what I want to do. I want to have authentic, I want to get the reality of what people are thinking, not just what they're saying. And something that you've done with your last two films is you've essentially developed, I don't have a better word for it, you've developed a method of storytelling that's a little bit different. I mean, it may take 10 years, to extract that authenticity out of it, but something you said even about in The Act of Killing, where the perpetrators are recreating the scenes from 50 years ago, and a progression happens. At first, things are really ludicrous of what they're doing, and you're not able to penetrate something, but then by the end, of course, there is a realism to what is happening there, which didn't happen at the start. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you've discovered in this method that you've applied now with in 3 films, or especially in The Act of Killing. Can you just talk about what that method is, how you, if you have a method, if you feel like it's something that you can translate into a future documentary? Thinking about the audience who's asking, we want to do that too. Is it replicable?
Well, I think it is replicable, and I'm developed to the extent that I'm now sort of feverishly working on developing new projects. And what happens now that I can no longer return to Indonesia and I'm making new work outside Indonesia, I'm trying to extract the most salient lessons from this decade of work there. I think the first thing that's, and indeed The Look of Silence, are not films about the genocide and the events of 1965 per se. They're events about the present. They're events about impunity in the present. They're events about the present-day legacy of the genocide. They're both about what happens now and what are the consequences of 50 years of the perpetrators still being in power. When you see it that way, you can see that The Act of Killing is a film about the lies, the fantasies that the perpetrators have told themselves and imposed on the whole society, justifying their actions. It's a film about storytelling, fantasy, escapism, and guilt. And in that sense, because it's a film about escapism and fantasy, it's inevitably a flamboyant film, a kind of fever dream of a film. And so if you look at it that way, you shouldn't, to try and extrapolate some lessons here, the dramatizations in The Act of Killing are not, in fact, reenactments, really, of what happened in 1965. They're dramatizations of the multiple conflicting scripts that the perpetrator and fantasies that the perpetrators tell themselves and impose on the society so that they can live with who they are and what they've done. They're dramatizations of Anwar's fantasy of himself as a film noir anti-hero. They're dramatizations of a bogus vision of redemption. In that sense, we have created through the method in The Act of Killing a kind of documentary, an observational documentary, not of Anwar's everyday life, but of his imagination and a whole regime's imagination. And there's a number of principles there that are at work, but one of the most basic is that the method is simple and recursive. When you see the edited film, it looks like a kind of, how did they ever get these people to make these musical numbers or these film noir scenes or cowboy scenes? But actually what we did, it's always good to take something, when you see something complicated, to try and break it down into its simplest steps. And the step with The Act of Killing was very simple. We would shoot one scene, and only one scene, and then screen it back for Anwar. And then Anwar would respond to the scene and propose the next scene. Now that was something we didn't come to right away. I'd spent 2 years filming every perpetrator I could find before I met Anwar. Anwar was the 41st perpetrator I filmed, and I had to think long and hard before screening the material back to him. What happened was I saw in Anwar someone who was as boastful at all 4 at that point, and no more boastful. He had the surreal boasting we see at the beginning of the film, where he takes me to a rooftop, shows how he killed and dances the cha-cha-cha in the spot where he's killed hundreds of people. Okay, I'm just going to go back a little. What I saw in Anwar was, on the one hand, something I'd seen in all 40 perpetrators that I'd met before that I filmed before I met Anwar. A surreal boastfulness about the killings, but I saw something else which was different, and that was an acknowledgement of a pain. At the beginning, the very first day I met him, he takes me to a roof. He shows how he killed hundreds of people at that one spot, and then dances the cha-cha-cha. But the reason he dances is because he says that in order to escape from his nightmares and his trauma, he spent his whole adult life going out drinking, taking drugs, and dancing to forget his pain. And then he says, and look, as though to banish the pain that he's just described, he says, look, I'll show you what a good dancer I am. And he dances in the spot where he's killed all these people. Obviously, that is to perform a denial of the meaning of what he's done, the moral meaning of what he's done. And I had this realization right there that perhaps the boasting that I'd spent 2 years filming in all these perpetrators before I met Anwar isn't really what it appears to be. Obviously, it is a sign of impunity, but it may not be a sign of genuine pride. It can be the opposite, in fact, a sign that these men, at some level, know what they've done is wrong, are broken by it, traumatized by it, and are desperate to convince themselves that what they did was right so that they can live with themselves. Maybe boasting and trauma, or remorse and boasting, are two sides of the same coin. And to explore that, I did this thing with Anwar that I hadn't done with anybody else because it was dangerous, in the sense that dangerous because they could say, this makes me look bad. Anwar could say, this makes me look bad, and have us arrested. I screened this early footage of him on the roof back to him, and he looks very disturbed when he watches it. And he looks as though he absolutely sees in the mirror of the footage that what he did was wrong. But he doesn't dare say it was wrong. I think because to say that, and he doesn't even dare say this makes me look bad, because to say it makes me look bad would be to acknowledge, look, instead he somehow lies to himself and to me and says, you know, my costumes are wrong, my hair is wrong, my acting isn't good. And he proposes what he considers to be an improvement in the scene aesthetically, as though if he can fix the scene artistically, he can make it, if he can put it right artistically, he can put what he did right morally for himself. So it's as though he's trying to run away from the pain that he's sort of conjured or experienced by reenacting what he's done. He proposes an embellishment. And so we kept repeating that process where we would shoot a scene and show it to him, and shoot a scene and show it to him, and each time he would propose the next scene, we would workshop, have a little process of workshopping with him and his friends to make sure the next scene we would shoot would be exactly as he wished it to be in terms of lighting and mood and genre and costume and set. And I would agree to do this process not because I was trying to lead Anwar through some kind of psychodrama or to get him to recognize the moral meaning. I think each scene that Anwar would propose to shoot would promise to be a more powerful allegory for impunity. And I felt in this whole process that I'd been entrusted by the survivors and the human rights community to expose a regime of impunity on their behalf, to expose a regime of fear and corruption and thuggery that the perpetrators had built. So I would agree to continue because I was getting further and further in this expose of this moral vacuum that the killers had presided over. But Anwar, I think, was always running away from his pain. And so so it's not surprising, given that what's fueling the process for him, in a way, is his own conscience. It's not surprising that these dramatizations become a kind of prism through which he sees the moral meaning of what he's done, and glimpses the unimaginable at the end of the film. And so from all of this, I think we can extrapolate that we recognize that whenever we film anybody, they start performing idealized versions of themselves. Of who the real, our relationship as human beings to fantasy, and an ability to document the human imagination, if we allow people to perform instead of trying to get them to act natural, and then screen these performances back for people. Essentially, there's a method of self-staging, which I think is woefully underexplored in nonfiction film. Jean Rouch explored it, but the technical conditions of his filmmaking, sync 16 millimeter film with Nagra sound, those technical constraints would have made what I did with Anwar Congo and with the perpetrators in Indonesia astronomically expensive. To shoot 1,000 hours of footage would have required an airplane hangar and dozens of editing assistants. It would have been impossible. I think that with the new technology available and with this method of self-staging, there's a whole realm of nonfiction filmmaking which was completely closed to us before, and that's the direction that I intend to continue.
And so we have a number of questions that are coming in from Google+, and we will absolutely get to many of them very soon. But you know what you've been talking about for the last couple of minutes, Joshua, is about a lot about the editing process as well. And we actually talked to Niels Anderson, who's your editor on The Act of Killing and also Look of Silence. And he's been editing documentaries for 40 years and told us that he has had a profound experience working with you, even after editing for that long. And something that he said that I thought was really interesting was that, actually I'm just going to read it. He said, what is interesting for me, because I'm looking for the truth of an authentic moment, is when suddenly the performance cracks. I think we human beings can smell when people are authentic. I think that's a lot of what you're getting at. But something else in this process is that you were working essentially very closely with Anwar for a pretty long period of time, but at the same time, you know that your loyalties were always with the survivors. So how did you navigate that when you knew that you may be violating the trust of your main subject, and how did you work with him when that could happen?
Well, I tried to be as open as possible, so that when Anwar, at the beginning, I think what drew many of the perpetrators into the project to participate. I mean, I think we have to think about why are they participating, and then where is the violation in quite precise terms. If there is a violation of trust, where is it? I think that of course leads to the question, why did the perpetrators participate? All 40 perpetrators that I was filming before I met Anwar would take me to the places they killed the first day or second day I would meet them, launch into these demonstrations of how they killed, hadn't brought along friends to play victims. And I would propose to them from the outset, look, I feel like I'm not just getting testimony from you, I'm also getting performance. I want to understand how, and I would be open about this, I want to understand, and performance is always intended for an audience, and I want to understand as much as what you did, but also how you want to be seen, and by whom. How do you want to be remembered by your grandchildren? How do you want to be seen by the world? And I think that, because I think if I can show that, I can show what these events mean to you and to your society. And given that these events are historical, and that would perhaps appeal to their vanity when I would say that, they became actors, historical actors, as they would call themselves in Indonesia, they would then be willing to go with this unorthodox method that I would propose, in which I'd say, okay, so show me, you want to show me what you've done. But I will also film you and your fellow Death Squad veterans discussing what you want to show, and equally what you want to leave out. And in that way, see how you want to be seen and how you really see yourself and what this means to you and to your society. So first of all the participants in the film always knew that they're not making a second film. They're only making scenes for my film. That is, there is no film within the film. It's just a strange method that we've used. They know that from the outset. And secondly, the method, if you think of it that way, was not of letting them dramatize what they'd done or dramatize their memories of genocide in whatever ways they wish. The method was not a trick to get them to open up. On the contrary, it was a response to their openness, a way of trying to understand it. For whom are they being open and why? And I think that there were two reasons why perpetrators would participate. One, especially, and this would especially apply to the most powerful perpetrators, the political leaders, the commanders, a kind of vanity. They wanted to inscribe themselves as the unsung heroes of modern Indonesia. But I think for men like Anwar and Herman and Adi, the lower ranking, these are now men who've become powerful, but at the time of the executioners, but they were executioners, not commanders. I think those people they would participate because they had a need to talk about what they'd done. And very quickly, and I think because they were haunted by these awful memories of cutting off heads and strangling people with things that are unimaginable, they had the need to sugarcoat those terrible memories with the sweet rhetoric of a victor's history celebrating what they've done. So they would tell, and in talking about something as awful as killing, in these heroic terms, they would give the lie every single time to the heroic rhetoric. And that's what made focusing on the executioners rather than the commanders so important in terms of my basic project of giving the lie to the national, or exposing the national myth that the genocide was heroic as a lie. because it was obviously a lie every time these men, the executioners like Anwar, would talk about it. Now, very quickly though, because I think they were trying to need terrifying memories, because they felt the need to talk about that, they would very quickly talk about their nightmares and their fears, at which point I would open up to them about my own views. Consider the scene in The Act of Killing, which was filmed relatively early, where I say to Adi Zulkadri in the car, I say to him, look, you've participated in war crimes, what if you're brought to The Hague? And Adi says, well, look, Joshua, even if what you're finding out is true, it's not good. Sometimes the truth should remain buried. And I say, for the millions of victims' families, if the truth comes out, and specifically the moral truth that what you did was wrong, if that comes out for the survivors, that's good. In that moment, I'm revealing, of course, my loyalties. And Anwar, despite the warnings of many people, you see them in the film telling him, stop making this film, Anwar always decided to continue, because I don't think he was trying to look good. I think he was trying to deal with his pain. And I think that's why when he saw the complete film and he saw the uncut 2-hour and 40-minute version of, maybe it is the version, anyone seeing this can see it on Netflix as the director's cut, or it's on DVD here too. He saw the full movie and he said, this film, Joshua, was silent and tearful, and then said, this film shows what it's like to be me. And I'm relieved to have finally been able to show what these events have meant, and not merely what I've done. So Anwar never felt betrayed by this film, and neither did Herman. And to the extent that Adi recognized that this film would jeopardize their power as perpetrators, he says that very clearly in the film. And those debates are unfolding with real candor right in the movie itself.
Okay, we've got questions, many, many questions, and we're going to get to as many as we can. This is a question which dovetails really nicely about what you just said. This comes from Kim on Google+, and her question is, do you structure the story during production or wait entirely until post? As a director, do you work with an editor during production or wait until post?
No, I wait until post. Now that said, the film is very largely chronological. One of the few, and if you were to see the uncut version of the film, which I encourage you to if you like the movie, and you can bear watching it again, then it's even more chronological than the shorter version. Often when you shorten a film, you have to take things from the end, put direction to give it more of a direction at the beginning. But if you watch the uncut 159-minute version of the film, it's very chronological. The only thing that's really out of sequence are the cameos with the very high-ranking politicians, because we had to save that shooting until the end in order to for safety. We realized that filming with the Vice President of Indonesia, if he were to have any doubts about what we're doing, that could jeopardize our access for everything else that we needed to shoot. So we saved all of that till the end. But the final scene with Anwar on the roof is the very last time I filmed with Anwar, 5 years after the scene at the beginning where he first takes me to the roof, which was the first day I met him. Anwar is, of course, the surreal vignettes at the fish, those are out of sequence because they come throughout the film. I would shoot for 3 or 4 months at a time and then return home to London and Copenhagen, where I was living throughout the making of this film, and spend 4 to 6 months working through my footage, looking for funding to return and shoot the next piece. I would shoot until I felt that I was overwhelmed, lost in the mountain of footage, and then return and work through the footage through logging and maybe roughly editing some sequences to get my bearings, discussing with my Indonesian crew, with Anwar, what we needed to do to continue, and then I would return. But I only really started with the editing after the bulk of the shooting was done.
And also, in the conversation we had with Niels, one of the questions was also that there was a question of whether the story was really Anwar's story. I mean, you had so much footage, you could have told any number of stories. So that was a decision that came. When was that decision made? I
I think where my dialogue with Niels was really helpful there was the recognition, because there's two things that happen in the film, and particularly in the uncut version of the film. I think in the shorter versions of the film, there's kind of a braiding of a political story about corruption and expose Anwar's downward spiral into a recognition of some indigestible and painful reality. But I think in the uncut version of the film, Anwar himself also grows, and particularly through his relationship with Herman. That relationship and Anwar grows to be a vessel for the entire moral vacuum, for the brokenness of this whole society. And I think that was something that balance, what really came clear, what Niels really brought to that editing process was a recognition that if the audience could identify with Anwar, and we could become as intimate as possible with him, despite how awful the stories are, that we would recognize somehow that the film's political indictment would become a universal indictment. It wouldn't be a film about Indonesian corruption or the legacy of this one genocide. It would be a film about what happens when humanity individually and collectively. That version of the film, I think, the fact that Anwar as an individual character is constructed to become more and more a vessel for this national nightmare. Somehow he becomes, somehow even the distinction between the individual lie and the collective lie dissolves, and it becomes about what does it mean that human beings subsist on lies and on fantasy, and lies, and what are the effects of these lies, and that of course those insights are what make, I think, the future of my filmmaking feel urgent to me, namely this exploration of how are we constituting ourselves through self-deception, through fantasy, through lies. I think that is the urgent question of our times, particularly as we face these enormous problems that we collectively refuse and individually refuse to face, including things like, the global ecological collapse as a result of climate change. So I think I just want to say one more thing. The process was always Anwar's meaning, and shooting was always Anwar's process. And early in the shooting, long before Niels and I started working together, we knew this was Anwar's film. Okay. The intimacy was Niels's. The intimacy really came was an insight of Niels very early in the editing.
We're not questioning your genius.
No. I didn't mean to. I mean, Niels is an absolute genius, and I don't want to. I didn't mean that in any way to discredit his. But since there's filmmakers here who want to know how we work,
yeah,
there were not 6 other Anwars who we could have made a film about. I only went through this journey with Anwar, and I think that kind of focus is a decision you as filmmakers need to take much earlier than the editing.
We have a question going back to possibly what we could consider the climactic scene with Anwar. So this is a question from Heather, and she says, "You were very blunt with him at the end of the film, leading to probably what I felt was the most horrific part of the film. A man realizing the depth of what he'd done, but maybe not. I wasn't 100% sure. What made you say what you did to him?"
I think that there's all these layers that make of what's happening for Anwar at the end that's so painful, and that makes that ending so ambiguous and ultimately, therefore, I think devastating. I think what the question is referring to is this moment where Anwar says, while watching himself play the victim, he says, "Now I know this is what my victims felt." And he starts going into it and almost building up a kind of trying to really empathize with them. He says, "My dignity's been destroyed here. That's what I did to them." He's really trying in that moment, and he sits. He says Anwar sits there and watches himself play the victim, and he says, "Here, my dignity's been destroyed," and he's watching, speaking of himself playing the victim, being tortured in this film noir scene, and then he says, "I've lost," and then he said, and he's trying to I think, do the imaginative labor of empathy, to which I then said, and although I think he's really trying, like he feels some need at that point in the process to try to empathize, I sort of doubted that he was really, I sort of doubted whether perhaps he was doing this for me, and also something became very, very, and for the film, and it made me angry, that doubt. And I think it was obvious to me that he's watching himself acting in a stylized film noir set. And so I just couldn't help but say the truth, which was, look, on whatever they were feeling is much worse than themselves, and talking about yourself again, because they're dying and you're acting. I said to him in that moment of anger, it was this feeling that I should say, whatever they're feeling, we should honor it with silence, and we should honor it, give it the honor and the space that it deserves, and not say, oh, this is now I'm feeling this pain, even if that's important. So I think in that, I felt offended that he immediately said, now I'm feeling what they felt. So it just felt too neat, too easy. So I said to him, now you're feeling, I said, now, of course what they felt was far worse than what you're feeling, because they were dying and you're acting. And in that moment, I think, that's the moment where he starts to, I think, cry a little bit, and he looks shocked, like he'd never thought of this before, and he looks down into the TV, and it's as though he's glimpsing this unbridgeable abyss between all the lies that he's told himself, all the fantasy image of her that we've spent 2.5 hours watching him act out, and who he really is, who he's really become, what he's really turned himself into by doing this. And I think in the final scene, that ambiguity is still there. He takes me to the roof. He says, this is where I tortured and killed people. I know it was wrong. And as if saying that for the first time opens a door in which his body just ignores the performance that he's trying to do. I mean, I think he's trying to simply, in a collected, cool, clear way, say this is where I killed people, and then speak about what it means a little bit, and then say this is how we did it. But it's as though his body's rebelling against his words, which are effectively the same words we've been hearing since the beginning of the film. And he starts this horrible retching, and he retches, I don't know, 10 times or something. This animal, guttural sound. And I stood there against the wall of that roof with the camera, thinking, what do I do? And I wanted to put my arm on him. I mean, my first instinct was this thing that we as Americans, my first instinct was to put my arm on him and say it's going to be okay. But I knew in that moment, no, this is what it looks like when it's really never going to be okay. Here's a man who's trying to vomit up the ghosts that haunt him, only to find that nothing comes up, because what haunts him is himself. Because we are our pasts, and he'll never escape it. And so what can he do? Can he really look at that and say, I'm changed and this was wrong? No, he has to live with himself. So then he says, his final lie in the film, he says, not sure this is in the shorter version that's screened on POV, but it's definitely in the uncut version of the film. He says, why did I have to kill them? Because my conscience told me they had to be killed. So he's still lying. If he were pretending to retch, he wouldn't lie there. He would say, oh, and I feel terrible about it. But he's still trying to cling to the script. But his body just totally rejects it, and he starts retching again. And I don't think we've ever heard in film that sound before. I think it's the first time that I can think of where we really see in cinema, and it's the result of this successive staging of creation of safe space. We could gradually build to this. I think this is the first time in cinema where we see what that kind of guilt and the use does to a human body. It's the first time we see the unit, the time's arrow only goes in one way. This sense as he looks around that filthy rooftop and thinks of all the ghosts that he can never, all the dead that can never be wakened. and he's overcome by it. I mean, it was the most awful thing I've ever experienced. And when he leaves the film at the end, when we leave him, I have no sense that we're leaving a man who's undergone a catharsis or someone who's redeemed. We're seeing a man who's destroyed and who's broken.
Thank you for that answer. We have many, many more questions, so we'll get to as many as we can. This is a question from Justin. Hi, Joshua. Speaking about your filmmaking process, what would you say you've learned from the making of The Act of Killing that you applied to The Look of Silence? Or rather, is there something that helped you better prepare yourself for making the second film that you learned from the first?
Well, the Act of Killing particularly, I'm sorry to keep doing this but I guess I encourage you all to watch it if you haven't. If you see the longer cut of the film, every sequence in the film culminates in these these empty spaces with these often haunted by a single figure, often with a single figure. And these haunted landscapes are moments where these cuts to these haunted landscapes are moments where the perspective of the act of killing abruptly shifts to that of the absent dead. I hope the dead haunt the whole film, but in those moments there's this sort of radical shift in the film's perspective. And in the Look of Silence, I knew that I wanted to create a film where we enter that space and we immerse the viewer physically in that space for 90 minutes and make the viewer 100 minutes and make the viewer feel what is it like to have to live for 50 years in that fear and silence, in that haunted landscape surrounded by the still powerful killers. So people will see the two films and say, oh, they're formally quite different, and indeed The Look of Silence doesn't use the successive layers of self-staging that I've described earlier. But The Look of Silence is, I think, formally precisely complementary to The Act of Killing, and I don't think it's any more conventional. I think it's just as experimental in form. It's very dramatic because these confrontations with the perpetrators, where survivors are confronting perpetrators, are things we've never seen before in cinema. I don't think we've ever seen a documentary where survivors confront perpetrators while the perpetrators still retain an absolute monopoly on power. We've seen films where perpetrators and survivors meet, always removed from power. There's this confrontation, and the perpetrators are still in power. So that lends it this drama, but at the same time, the film is constructed as a kind of poem within that space of silence, a poem about what 50 years of silence and a prison of fear does to the human body, to a family, to memory, to a mother, to a son, to a father. And then one thing I think I learned was that well, one thing that's important is that those unprecedented confrontations are only possible because I shot the act of killing. When Adi, the main character in The Look of Silence, said to me he wanted to confront the perpetrators, he only said that because he'd spent 5 years watching the footage that I filmed with Anwar and his friends, and it had transformed him, and he now felt he needed to meet them. And I only agreed because I realized, well, maybe this could be safe because all the perpetrators know about the production of The Act of Killing but haven't seen it yet, which means they think I'm close to their superiors, the vice president of Indonesia, ministers in the government, the governor, heads of their paramilitary organization, and therefore they would have to think 2 or 3 times before they would attack us physically or have us arrested, lest they should get in trouble for attacking a friend of their superiors. So I realized there was an opportunity to do something unprecedented because of this unique situation of having shot The Act of Killing but not yet released it. Finally, The Act of Killing that you should always, that when you're creating these staged moments, not staged, but these aesthetic create for drama to spiral out of control, real life drama to spiral out of control, it's best to shoot with multiple cameras whenever you can. We didn't do that always in The Look of Silence, but because with the most powerful perpetrators it was dangerous to have, we would shoot it with as small a crew as we could so we got out of there quickly, but we would always shoot with 2 cameras if we could because it allowed us to capture every reaction. And if you see The Look of Silence, something we learned in The Act of Killing was that much more than the lines, the dialogue, it's the reactions, the the reaction shots, these close-ups where you first glimpse the crack that Niels Anderson was talking about in his interview with POV, that it's there that you first see that when the mask is falling, you see the glimpse of fear or sadness or trouble. And that, as I said earlier when I talked about my theory of documentary as being these moments where things spiral out of control, that's where cinema begins. And so it's very important not to focus on the words. And with one camera, you're much more tempted to pan back and forth and follow the conversation. With two, you're free to focus on the reactions.
Okay, we have just a few minutes, so we'll try to get lightning
And I'll try and be
round
faster
through these questions. So many people know your work and where you live, apparently. Here's a question from Ashley, who asks, and actually this has come up a couple times about the location and where you make films from. So Ashley's question is, how does being a filmmaker based in Copenhagen compare to if you lived in the United States?
I've never really been a filmmaker based in the United States, so I can't draw that comparison very easily, but some of our really significant parts of our support come from the United States, including from POV. But one thing that we have a very good film community, documentary community in Denmark, where we are very open to dialogue. We're small. We're all based in this small city, Copenhagen, and we invariably watch each other's films when they're still bad. Every film, no matter how great, has been terrible, and it's first assembly first. Watch each other's films and support each other and really try and help each other as openly as we can to get to make our films good. There's a spirit of solidarity rather than competition, and I think you have that in some communities in the United States too. I think that's really important. Also, the Danish Film Institute has enshrined in Danish film law a rule that any film they finance for any film they finance, final cut must rest with the director. So we have a kind of artistic freedom enshrined in law, which is very important.
Okay, and this is probably dovetailing with that question as well. Someone who knows that this was a 10-ish year production. The question from Shyok is, how did you fund the project through this long period?
Well, the beginning, those 2 years when I was filming every perpetrator I could find and starting to work with the survivors from 2003 to 2005, I was living in the UK, and in order so that I could stay in the UK, I ultimately became a British citizen that way. I had a stipend to do making work was the core of my dissertation. And that stipend I used to spend as much time shooting on a very, very shoestring budget with me doing camera and maybe one Indonesian assistant taking sound. I used that stipend to finance that work from 2003 to 2005. Then, on the basis of that footage, and on the basis of having a PhD, I was able to get an academic grant in the UK from the Arts and Humanities Research Council and from the University of Westminster, which gave me 4.5 years of a salary and a modest production budget to shoot what became the core of the act of killing. Then, on the basis of that material, I was invited to Copenhagen CPH Docs, the Copenhagen Documentary Film Festival, to do a master class in 2006, I think, 2007, where we showed clips from what became the act of killing. And my Danish producer approached me afterwards and said, "I'd love to produce this film if you don't have a producer." At that point, we realized we were going to spend the entire academic grant shooting the film. We would really need help finishing the film, so we accepted that offer. I moved to Denmark almost 4 years ago to start the editing of the act of killing, and it was a year and a half process where we realized that Denmark gradually felt more like home than London ever did, and so I relocated to Copenhagen. Okay. And the final the editing and completion was funded in a more traditional way by European Film Institutes, the Danish Film Institute, the Norwegian Film Institute, the European Community, the European Union, and then a collection of NGOs, public service broadcasters, and philanthropic foundations.
And those all came at different points. It's not like they all came in a big burst.
Well, I mean, I was really a first-time director making this film. This is my debut film, and so it was really hard to raise money for this before the core sequences in this film were shot and even roughly edited, because the idea sounded crazy, and they needed also assurance from the Indonesian human rights community and the Indonesian filmmaking community and survivors community, that this film is absolutely authentic and essential as an intervention in Indonesia as well, that it wasn't this kind of immoral, crazy thing in which a foreigner flies in and makes a film. I should just say, I always felt, more than an American or Danish or British filmmaker going to Indonesia, I always felt like I was an agent of this human rights community and survivors in Indonesia doing a work that they could not do themselves and that they'd entrusted me to do, and that I had a moral obligation to complete.
Okay, we have time we'll try to squeeze in maybe 2 more questions. We have a question from Justin from Google+. Are there any particular books, films, or resources that helped to shape your narrative or approach to making nonfiction films?
Okay, you just broke up at the beginning of it. I only heard from shape your narrative.
Are there any particular books, films, or resources that help to shape your narrative or approach to making nonfiction films?
There are certainly films that have inspired me, and they include Mohsen Makhmalbaf's Salam Cinema, his daughter Samira Makhmalbaf's The Apple, Jean Rouche's films Petit à Petit, Moi Noir, Jaguar, Werner Herzog's films, Even Dwarfs Started Small. It's not seen as a documentary film, but I think it's somehow a work of nonfiction only because everything it tells is absolutely true. But above all, my own sense that my relationship with my editor, people will often say, be surprised that Nielsen and I always work together in the editing room. It's not because I don't trust him or because I'm in any way trying to, again, dialogue comes this remarkable synthesis that's greater than different from what either of us could bring to the film alone. So we're always together in the editing room the whole time, and I think that his experience, his insights are really crucial. I think those are, and finally your own heart and your sense that I never think about things like a 3-act story structure. I never think of myself as a storyteller. I think of myself as an explorer, and then I think of the editing as a process. The first part of the editing, where you're editing sequences and putting together an assembly, is a process of excavating the layers of meaning in your material. And then I see the second part, where you're really putting the film together, as a process of translating this 5 years of experience for the viewer, or 2 hours, however long your film is. So I think you just have to, your guide should come from your heart and your creative relationships above all.
And I'm going to sneak in one last question if we can, and I'm going to rephrase it a little bit. We had a couple of questions about common mistakes that you saw first-time filmmakers make, but maybe this is a question at the same time, because essentially The Act of Killing was your first film. Were there any mistakes that you could point to say, I made these mistakes, I will never make them again, and please, no filmmaker should ever do what I did again?
Well, one thing about having and giving myself, I mean, I felt this film was so important that I would give myself as much time as I needed. I think it's really terrible in life to live in regret and to cling to your mistakes. I mean, there's such simple, stupid ones like, you know, technical things that we all realize right away, like you shouldn't adjust the camera in the middle of an important moment. You shouldn't zoom in the middle of an important moment if you don't like zooms and things. I think the most important thing, though, is if you're a first-time filmmaker, to see that your first film is a learning experience and give yourself the time to learn and to feel confident that if you don't flinch, if you're there and you don't, I think one mistake that I made early in the process that you should never make is never to flinch. It's something Werner Herzog puts this a little bit cruelly, but I don't really see it as cruel because I see it as loving. I think that the film, he says the filmmaker should be merciless in her gaze. I think the filmmaker shouldn't flinch, shouldn't recoil from pain. Even if your character is breaking down, you have to think, or tells you to stop filming, you have to be aware, where is your obligation here? Is it to the film? Is it to your character? Is it to something bigger? In my new film, The Look of Silence, we have perpetrators saying stop filming, and I don't, because I realize my moral obligation in that moment isn't to the perpetrator, but to history and to the survivors and to the human rights community. I think part of the most important thing is give yourself time to make mistakes and learn from your mistakes in the production itself. And then don't neurotically worry about them. Know that you will find solutions to those mistakes in a good editing process. And then don't look back and just learn from them in the future. Ask yourself what worked. And you'll remember what not to do. You don't have to make neurotic lists of that.
All right. Well, thank you for leaving us with that wisdom. We'll have to end the chat on that note. Filmmaker, explorer, genius, Joshua Oppenheimer, thank you very much for joining us. If you want to hear more from Josh, we do have on the POV website, pbs.org/POV, you'll see more from Josh. Well, we've got a film update talking about what's happened since the act of killing. We have a video interview and much more. Also, Sina Sorensen, who you mentioned as your producer, is also interviewed, as is Neil Anderson. So much more information and much more you can learn from both Joshua and Sina and from Niels. So the film, it's not streaming right now, but if you do want to watch the POV version, it will be back. Let us know that you would love to see the act of killing on Twitter and Facebook and Google+, and we'll bring it back. If you want to stay connected with the films, I'm assuming the best way is to go through the website. So if that's right, theactoftokilling.com and thelookofsilence.com. And I hinted at this before, but The Look of Silence premiered at the Venice Film Festival and won the Grand Jury Prize there. It was just at CPH Docs where it won a top award, so congratulations on all of that and all the success that will come from The Look of Silence. I know it's just getting started. So thank you again, Joshua, for being with us today. If you have any final words.
Well, I just to say, if anyone now has seen this but hasn't seen The Act of Killing and wants to see also the complete film, it's also on Netflix and iTunes and DVD. Maybe you want me to plug it coming back on POV, but it's there, and the unabridged version that I kept referring to is out in the US as the director's cut. It's just the complete and original film, so that's also there for all of you to watch. And thank you so much for your generous, everyone, and you too, Adnan. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Joshua. It's all you. And also, the film is on Blu-ray as well, right? It's not just DVD. It's on Blu-ray.
Blu-ray, DVD, iTunes, Netflix, Instant. It's out there.
Okay, so you can find that through theactoftokilling.com, and we also highly, highly recommend that you watch those versions as well.
One last thing, I think that it's actually actoftokilling.com, the American website, not The Act of Killing. It's just actoftokilling.com.
Okay, well, thanks. People can find it. I have the wrong link here. But yes, great, thank you. And so please do stay connected with us. Doc Chats will continue from Google+. Let us know what you want to talk about and who you want to talk to. Submit your ideas to Google+. Stay connected with us. Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, we're everywhere. Thank you again, and we'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.
Pleasure.